In the winter of 1824, the air over Hadley, Massachusetts carried a silence that felt unnatural, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Families spoke in whispers. Curtains were drawn earlier than dusk, and behind every shuttered window, one name was carried from mouth to mouth, never loud, never in daylight: Ezekiel Drummond. A man whose eyes, pale as frozen rivers, seemed to pull truth from those who dared meet them. 33 seconds. If you understand what I'm about to reveal, comment the phrase, "I see the hidden," twice below, to bind yourself to this knowledge. He wasn't a murderer in the way you imagine. His violence was not with knife or gun, but with suggestion, tone, the smallest inflection of a word. He dismantled human will the way a physician dissects flesh, precise, methodical, irreversible. Men of science could not name what he was. Priests could not pray away what he became. Families that had lived for generations simply walked barefoot into the snow, leaving behind warm fires, unfinished meals, and the impression of a guest who had sat among them but never left footprints in the earth. What you are about to hear was buried, not because it was false, but because the institutions tasked with protecting you feared what you would become if you knew. For Drummond had uncovered something darker than insanity. He had discovered how fragile the cage of identity truly is, how simple it is to whisper a phrase that rearranges a man's will into obedience. Before I continue deeper into his story, subscribe so you do not miss the forbidden knowledge that follows. And in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know what ground carries those who awaken. Remember, the science of 1824 had no definition for men like him. Today, they would label him with sterile words: psychopathy, sociopathy, antisocial disorder. But these are cages of language, not truth. Drummond was not a patient to be studied. He was the study itself. He was the experiment, and Hadley was his laboratory. This is the descent into the mind of a man who proved the human spirit could be rewritten. He was not a monster science could explain. He was something else entirely. Ezekiel Drummond did not storm into Hadley as a stranger to be feared. He entered as a scholar, a man of credentials and refinement, armed with letters of recommendation from Harvard and whispered endorsements from Boston's intellectual elite. He came cloaked not in menace, but in brilliance, and brilliance disarms. The townsfolk adored him at first. He was eloquent, patient, and attentive in ways no one else dared to be. Farmers spoke of how he listened with the focus of a confessor, nodding, eyes never breaking from theirs, as though every word carried eternal weight. Mothers praised his dedication to their sons, claiming he gave each boy a sense of being chosen, singular, destined for greatness. What no one admitted aloud was that they left conversations with him feeling less like themselves, like a mirror had been tilted, showing their reflection just slightly altered. The subtlety was his craft. A man who yells commands invites resistance. A man who whispers them plants seeds, and Drummond was a planter of seeds. Phrases left dangling in thought, questions that burrowed into conscience, observations so intimate they felt like prophecy. He wasn't content to teach subjects. He taught minds to doubt their own foundations. At the academy, his methods were called revolutionary. Students kept journals, not of equations or translations, but of thoughts they had never voiced aloud. Fears, desires, secret impulses, all recorded, all handed over to him. And in his study, under candlelight, Drummond read those journals with the hunger of a priest devouring confessions. He underlined words, circled patterns, and when he returned the pages, he spoke to each student as if he had been inside their dreams. Parents praised his genius. But genius is often indistinguishable from predation. For every student left more confident, another left more hollow, their loyalties shifting subtly away from blood and home and toward the pale-eyed professor who told them who they really were. By the time whispers began, it was too late. Drummond was already rooted. He was trusted in the churches, respected by merchants, invited into the homes of families who would one day vanish. He had woven himself into the heart of Hadley like a parasite disguised as an organ, indistinguishable until it begins to feed. By the autumn of 1823, Hadley had grown used to the figure of Professor Drummond pacing the streets at twilight. Every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, he emerged from his home in a long black coat, a leather-bound journal tucked under his arm, and walked the town with the precision of ritual. His route never varied, yet no one could say what he sought. At first, townsfolk dismissed it as eccentricity. Scholars often carried odd habits after all. But soon, patterns emerged. He lingered outside certain homes longer than others. He paused at garden gates, scribbling notes while families inside laughed, argued, or prayed, unaware that they were subjects in an experiment they had not agreed to. More than one mother drew her curtains earlier after catching his pale eyes fixed on her children through the window. Neighbors asked him once, cautiously, what he wrote in that ever-present journal. Drummond smiled with that unsettling softness of his and claimed he was studying the American family in its natural environment. He said his notes would one day form a treatise to enlighten generations. The explanation was so polished, so authoritative, that those who questioned him felt foolish for doubting. But unease lingered, like a chill that remained after the fire had died. His nightly walks were not idle. He was building a map, not of streets, but of people. He charted tensions between fathers and sons, cataloged whispered marital disputes, noted which children obeyed instantly and which resisted. He was not observing community, he was dissecting it, and there were moments, rare but unforgettable, when his gaze met that of a passerby and something impossible stirred. One woman swore she saw her own reflection flicker in his pupils, as though her identity itself was being recorded. A farmer reported that after locking eyes with him, he awoke 3 nights in a row to dreams where Drummond stood at the foot of his bed, silent, patient, wait-eating. What no one yet understood was that these walks were rehearsals. Every note he scrawled, every family he scrutinized, was another thread in a net he was weaving across Hadley. By the time winter came, that net would close, and families who believed themselves free would discover they had been studied, measured, and prepared for something they could not resist. The winter of 1824 came early, cruel, and heavy. Snow buried Hadley beneath white silence, pressing families into their homes, forcing them closer together around their hearths. Yet, in that intimacy, something foreign had already entered with them. For by mid-January, the Chamberlain family, Samuel, Mercy, and their 3 children, vanished. T3 seconds. If you feel the weight of what is unfolding, comment. The silence takes use. Twice below to mark your place among the initiated, the Chamberlains had been pillars of the town. Samuel was a grain merchant, whose honesty fed the valley. Mercy, a woman of unshakable kindness, was known for tending to the sick. Their children were bright, musical, full of promise. On the night of January 14th, their neighbors saw nothing unusual. By dawn, their chimney smoked no fire. When Abigail Hartwell, their longtime neighbor, entered the Chamberlain home, she found a scene that even Constable Brewster would later describe as unnatural, as though life itself had been erased. Breakfast lay set on their finest china, but uneaten, frozen solid by the bitter air. 4 bowls, and 1 extra place at the head of the table, waiting for a guest who had never arrived. There were no signs of violence. No broken locks, no missing valuables. Samuel's strongbox remained untouched. Mercy's jewelry still glittered in her dresser. Their heavy winter clothing hung neatly on pegs, as though they had walked willingly into the snow wearing only indoor garments. And indeed they had. For outside, 4 sets of bare footprints, 2 large, 2 small, led from the door in a perfect straight line into the forest. No staggering, no struggle, no hesitation, just a family walking into sub-zero wilderness, as though commanded by something stronger than instinct. Stronger than love of life itself. The search party followed the tracks until they vanished among the drifts. No bodies were ever found, no explanation satisfied. The official records would call it hysteria, a strange mania of the cold. But neighbors whispered the truth. Drummond had dined with the Chamberlains days before. He had sat at their fire, speaking in his low, hypnotic voice, and soon after, they became the first of many families to disappear. Hadley did not yet know it, but they were already living inside an experiment, one whose results would not be measured in books, but in vanished lives. The Chamberlains were not the last. Within weeks, 2 more families vanished in the same impossible manner. Fires extinguished, meals abandoned mid-bite, doors left ajar against the deadly cold. In every case, footprints trailed into the forest, bare feet pressed into snow deep enough to kill within minutes. None of them returned. None were ever found. At first, Hadley sought natural explanations. Disease perhaps, or madness brought on by the isolation of winter. Ministers preached that Satan had crept into the valley, punishing pride. Physicians called it a fever of the mind, a contagion of hysteria that spread through whispers. But explanations do not stop fear, they feed it. For fear spreads faster than illness. Neighbors who once welcomed each other into their homes now barred their doors at night. The Congregational church stood half empty on Sundays, its pews abandoned by families too afraid to leave their fires. And through it all, Ezekiel Drummond remained calm, composed, untouched by the panic he himself had seeded. Students still filled his academy, their journals swelling with confessions of nightmares, voices and impulses they could not understand. And in his private study, Drummond dissected those writings with meticulous care, as though he were charting not the lives of boys, but the architecture of their souls. The constable tried to question him once, pressing him about his association with the Chamberlains. Drummond met his stare with those pale, silver eyes and spoke softly. "What vanishes leaves no crime. What remains is only silence." The words, simple as they were, carried such weight that Brewster found himself withdrawing, ashamed of his suspicion, as though he were the one in error, not the professor. It was then the whispers began that Drummond's voice was not simply persuasive, but invasive, that his words were not heard but entered, rearranging the listener from within. The townsfolk did not speak it aloud, but in private they began to avoid his gaze, to shorten conversations, to cross the street when they saw his tall figure at dusk. Yet none dared confront him, for even fear bends beneath authority, and Drummond had woven himself into the fabric of Hadley's respect. And as the snow deepened that winter, so too did the disappearances. It was no longer a question of what had happened to the Chamberlains. It was a question of how many would follow. To understand Drummond's power, you must first abandon the illusion that your mind belongs solely to you. That belief, that your thoughts, impulses, and choices are your own, is the very weakness he exploited. He knew what science in 1824 could not yet articulate, that identity is fragile, a performance built on repetition. Interrupt the pattern, and the self begins to fracture. Drummond called it introspection, but what he practiced was intrusion. He demanded his students record not only their lessons, but their private dreams, fears, and doubts. These journals were not academic exercises. They were maps, guides to the weak points in every young man's defenses. One boy wrote of a father he could never please. Another confessed the guilt of thoughts he dared not name. Each page became a door, and Drummond learned how to open them all. When he returned their journals, his comments were never corrections but questions, carefully designed to unsettle. What if your fear is not weakness, but destiny? What if the voice you silence is the only truth you've ever had? The boys left his study not with answers, but with cracks in the bedrock of their own certainty. And through those cracks, Drummond poured suggestion like water freezing into stone. Parents praised him for awakening their son's intellect. They did not see that he was also eroding their loyalty. Over time, students began to quote him at the dinner table, adopting his words as if they were their own. Disagreements with fathers ended with silence, not rebellion, but withdrawal, as though the ties of family had been gently untied without anyone noticing. And when he spoke to adults, his methods were subtler still, a pause in the right place. A compliment veined with hidden doubt. A question that revealed he knew more than they had confessed. To speak with him was to feel both understood and undone. His voice was not merely sound. It was architecture. It built rooms in the mind where his words lingered, replaying, reshaping thought long after the conversation had ended. Drummond's genius was not that he discovered how to control men. It was that he discovered how easily men control themselves when given the right key, and Hadley was already unlocking one soul at a time. By the spring thaw of 1824, Hadley was no longer a town. It was a laboratory. The disappearances had shaken every household, but what was more terrifying was the silence of its leaders. The institutions that should have defended the people were already bending beneath Drummond's quiet dominion. The church was the first to fracture. Reverend Alcott, once a voice of thunder in the pulpit, found his sermons faltering. Parishioners noticed how he stumbled over scripture when Drummond's pale eyes fixed upon him from the front pew. Soon, his fire cooled into hesitation. His words grew soft, his warnings vague, as if the authority of heaven itself had been eroded. One Sunday, when asked directly if the disappearances were God's punishment, Alcott's voice trembled. Perhaps it is simply the order of things. A whisper that sounded eerily like Drummond's phrasing. The constabulary fared no better. Constable Brewster, once stern and uncompromising, became erratic. He opened investigations with zeal, only to abandon them days later, muttering that no crime had been committed if no bodies were found. Townsfolk whispered that he visited Drummond privately, and that when he emerged from those meetings, his face bore the same blank calm as the professor himself. The law had not collapsed, it had been rewritten. Even medicine bent. Dr. Calvin Mears, the Valley's only physician, began publishing curious pamphlets under Drummond's guidance. In them he described the vanishings not as tragedies, but as natural evolutions of the psyche, families surrendering to impulses larger than themselves. He presented it not as catastrophe, but as progress. Some read with outrage, others with secret relief, grateful to believe there was meaning in the chaos. And Drummond smiled, for belief itself was his scalpel. It was no accident. He had threaded himself into every system Hadley trusted: faith, law, and medicine. And once inside, he altered their pulse until they beat to his rhythm. By summer, townsfolk no longer asked, "Who will vanish next?" Instead, they began to murmur, "Perhaps it is meant to be." Acceptance had taken root where outrage should have lived. And when a people surrender their outrage, their chains no longer need to be forced upon them. They lift them willingly. The summer of 1825 should have been a season of reprieve. The valley's fields ripened, the river thawed, and for a moment the rhythms of life seemed to return. Yet beneath the sunlight, Hadley was rotting. Families whispered of moving west, of abandoning their farms and businesses. But by the time wagons were packed, doors were locked, and plans set, those families, too, were gone. The disappearances no longer struck with months between them. Now they came in clusters. In June, the pharaohs vanished, leaving a Bible open on their table, the final verse underlined in trembling ink, "And they shall be led away with cords, and none shall deliver them." In July, the Whitcombs' home was discovered empty, a kettle still steaming though no fire burned beneath it. By August, 3 households in a single week dissolved into nothing, as though Hadley itself were consuming its own. Search parties dwindled. What was there to search for? Trails of barefoot prints had become a macabre signature, appearing in dew-soaked grass across muddy lanes, even scorched into the dust of summer roads. Always leading outward, never back. Always in straight lines, unbroken, as though guided by a compass deeper than bone. Some still clung to reason. They spoke of mass hysteria, of fugitive wanderings into the wilderness. But reason failed in the face of repetition. How could infants walk into forests without a cry? How could elders abandon their beds without leaving so much as a groan? The disappearances carried the same shape every time, too precise, too patterned. And patterns, Drummond taught, were never accidents. By now, suspicion should have turned upon him openly. Yet it did not. For when grief-stricken relatives sought his counsel, Drummond received them with patience, with listening eyes, with words that soothed rather than accused. "Perhaps," he would murmur, "they were not taken but called." And in their anguish, many found solace in that idea, however terrible. Hadley was shrinking. Streets that once rang with laughter now echoed hollow at dusk. Shops shuttered, school bells grew silent. And still at the center of it all, Drummond stood untouched. His academy filled, his notebooks swelling with observations of a town unraveling not through violence, but through willing surrender. By autumn, it was no longer Hadley asking why the vanishings occurred. The town had begun to ask the far more dangerous question: when will it be our turn? It was in October of 1825 that the first fragments of truth began to leak from behind Drummond's carefully polished mask. A handful of his pupils, pale, sleepless boys with trembling hands, confessed to hearing things during their lessons. Not words spoken aloud, but vibrations that thrummed beneath his voice, as though another presence was speaking through him, hidden in the marrow of his syllables. One boy claimed that when Drummond fixed him with his silver gaze, the room bent. He described walls that breathed, shadows that shifted their positions though no candle moved. Another admitted that he no longer dreamed in his own memories, but in visions of places he had never seen, endless corridors of black stone, doorways opening into silence, staircases spiraling into nothing. And when asked how these visions ended, the boy whispered, with a voice saying my name, his voice. The journals Drummond collected began to show patterns, students writing the same sentences though they swore they had not copied one another. Sketches of identical symbols, circles intersected by crooked lines, shapes that twisted the eye when stared at too long, a language that was not theirs, but which they produced as if drawn by invisible hands. And within his private study, Drummond refined his theories. He wrote of identity not as fixed, but as malleable clay, shaped by suggestion. He called his method the removal of will. The disappearances, he suggested in notes never meant for public eyes, were not tragedies but demonstrations, proof that the psyche, once severed from the illusion of choice, could dissolve entirely into something else. What that something was, he never named outright, but in the margins he scrawled words that chilled even his assistants. The voice is patient. The voice is hungry. The voice is older than choice itself. By now, Hadley was unraveling faster than its people could comprehend. Entire streets lay silent, doors swung open to empty houses. And yet, when asked about Drummond, survivors would lower their eyes and whisper, "He understands." For he had convinced them of a lie far more dangerous than fear, that what was happening was not a curse, but a necessary passage, that they were not victims but participants. And through this illusion, his true experiment took shape. Not merely to observe the vanishings, but to orchestrate them. The winter of 1825 struck Hadley like no other. Snow fell in heavy, suffocating sheets, muting the town until it seemed less a place than a memory, but the snow did not hide the footprints. In the morning, entire lanes bore their marks, hundreds of them, pressing outward in perfect lines toward the forest. Doors were left ajar, windows shattered inward, as though by no force of this world, hearths still warm with firewood that would never be used again. At first, neighbors rushed to awaken those who remained. They pounded on doors, calling names, begging for answers. But house after house lay silent. In one night, 4 souls had vanished. By week's end, nearly half the town was gone. It was no longer a pattern. It was a purge. And yet Drummond remained. He walked the snow-draped streets without fear, his cloak dragging through the white drifts, his gaze lifted always eastward, as though listening for something only he could hear. When asked, he did not deny the disappearances. He only whispered, "The voice calls more clearly now. It cannot be stopped." His academy was nearly deserted, yet those who stayed were the most devoted. Survivors claimed they no longer ate or slept as they once did. Food lost its taste, sleep became shallow. They gathered at night in the lecture hall, reciting not prayers, but the strange geometries they had drawn in their journals. Circles intersected, lines crossing in impossible configurations, until the room itself seemed to vibrate with a low hum no ear could fully catch. By December, the hum grew louder. Townsfolk reported hearing it beneath the wind, beneath the crackle of their hearths, even beneath the sound of their own breath. A resonance too deep to belong to man or earth. And with each pulse, more families rose from their beds and walked barefoot into the snow, leaving no screams, no farewells, only the imprint of obedience. Those who resisted claimed Drummond no longer spoke in his own tongue. His words came halting, broken, as though another was speaking through him. Some swore his shadow no longer followed his body, but stretched in directions the sun did not command. The truth could no longer be denied. Drummond had not been recording the vanishings. He had been conducting them, and the voice, whatever it was growing stronger with each soul surrendered. By the first weeks of 1826, Hadley was a ghost town. Of the 200 families who had once filled its streets with life, scarcely 30 souls remained. They no longer spoke to one another except in whispers. They avoided the academy, though its great hall glowed each night with candlelight and echoed with chants not of this world. The few survivors who dared watch from a distance told of gatherings that began at midnight and stretched until dawn. Inside, Drummond stood at the center, his arms lifted, his voice carrying syllables no tongue should form. The students, what was left of them, responded in perfect unison. They carved the air with their hands, moving in shapes that bent the eye, gestures that seemed to fold the very space around them. Witnesses swore that, at times, the walls of the academy seemed to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. Windows would blacken, as though opening not onto the snowy streets, but into depths of endless night. One farmer, who stayed hidden long enough to glimpse what lay within, claimed he saw shapes moving in that darkness. Limbs too long, faces blurred, bodies that swayed in rhythm with the chanting. Drummond's appearance had changed too. His hair whitened in a single week. His skin grew gaunt, stretched thin, as though light itself recoiled from him. Yet his eyes, always his eyes, burned brighter, silver pools that no man could meet for long without trembling. When approached by the desperate, Drummond offered no more comfort. He only asked them a single question: why resist what was always meant to be? To some, those words were enough. They surrendered themselves willingly, walking barefoot through snow toward the woods. To others, they were the final sign that Hadley was lost. And so, one by one, the last families fled. Some abandoned their farms in the dead of night, carrying nothing but their children. Others tried to burn their homes, hoping fire might cleanse what had seeped into the soil. But no matter how far they traveled, they claimed the humming followed them still, like a pulse buried beneath the earth itself. By February, Hadley was nearly silent. Only the academy still lived, its windows glowing like the eyes of a beast that had swallowed the town whole. And within its walls, Drummond no longer taught, no longer explained. He listened to the voice that now spoke clearly, not just to him but through him. On the night of March 3rd, 1826, the last of Hadley's history was swallowed. There are no parish records of that evening, no town ledgers, no official accounts. Only the fevered recollections of a handful of wanderers who stumbled upon its ruins years later, and the half-mad journals of those who fled in time. The academy's windows blazed like 100 torches, spilling light that was not fire, not candle, but something rawer, something alive. The sound carried for miles, a resonance that split the silence of the forest. Witnesses described it not as music, nor speech, but as a vibration that pressed against the chest until breathing itself became difficult. Then came the shaking. The earth groaned as though something immense shifted beneath it. Chimneys toppled, rafters split, horses bolted into the snow, their cries rising above the hum, and from the academy's doors spilled the last of Drummond's disciples, their faces slack, their eyes unblinking silver. They did not run, they marched. In single file, they moved toward the woods, their bare feet leaving blood in the snow. What they followed was not seen, only felt a presence, vast and patient, that seemed to warp the air around it. Those who claimed to have glimpsed its outline spoke of a form not built for human sight, a distortion that pulled at thought itself, making memory stutter and vision fail. At the center of it all stood Drummond, no longer gaunt, no longer frail, but radiant with a terrible vitality. His voice rose above the thunder, carrying words that seared themselves into the ears of those who heard. The will was never yours. It never was. When the dawn broke, Hadley was gone, not just emptied, gone. Roads led nowhere. Fields collapsed into hollows where homes had stood. The academy itself was nothing but a scar of blackened stone, its foundation sunken into the earth, as if it had been pulled downward into some vast depth. All that remained were fragments, footprints in snow that led to nowhere, scraps of journals bearing symbols no scholar could decipher, and the silence of a town that had been erased not by plague, not by fire, but by something older, something waiting. And the vanishings of Hadley passed into rumor, into whispered legend. Yet those who listened closely swore the hum never left. They claimed, even generations later, that in certain winds, you could still hear it, the echo of a voice that had found its first true choir. History did not keep Hadley. By 1830, maps of the Connecticut Valley showed only empty woodland where the town had once stood. Surveyors reported errors of placement, as though the earth itself had shifted. No one could agree where Hadley had been, though travelers swore they had walked its streets only years before. It was erased not only from soil, but from memory, a place unmoored from history. And yet, Hadley was not forgotten. Letters emerged, smuggled into archives by trembling hands. Testimonies of those who fled spoke of the hum that followed them for years. Some claimed their children woke at night, standing at the window, staring eastward. Others confessed they could no longer dream of anything but doors, endless doors opening into a lightless expanse. The journals of Drummond, found decades later in a collapsed farmhouse miles away, were worse. Most were illegible, written in scripts no scholar could identify. But the last entry was simple, written in a firm hand untouched by madness. The voice is not of elsewhere. It is of here. It has always been of here. We were only the first to listen. Scholars dismissed the story as frontier myth, no different than witchcraft tales or campfire superstition. But Hadley's name lingers in old sermons and folklore, a whispered warning: never walk the woods at night. Never follow the sound that seems to come from beneath your own thoughts. And still, there are reports. Whole villages in the northern wilds that emptied overnight, farmsteads where the hearth still burns but the family is gone. Witnesses claiming that, in the right silence, you can hear a vibration beneath your ribs, as if the body itself remembers something the mind refuses. They say the voice does not need towns anymore. It only needs listeners. A single ear, a single heart, maybe yours. So if you hear it, that low, steady hum beneath the breath, beneath the silence, do not lean closer, do not follow. Because Hadley was not destroyed. It was not consumed. It was recruited. And the choir is still growing.